Welcome back to another episode of Preschool Pioneers Podcast. I am your host, Jeremy Walker. And on this episode of Preschool Pioneers Podcast, we're going to be talking about racism and riots. You can follow us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and subscribe to this podcast on all the major podcasting platforms. Now, I want to go ahead and get us started today with Preschool Pioneers, and this episode is entitled R is for Racism and Riots. Why? Well, because right now we're in June 2020, and this has been quite the year for us. We have had COVID-19, and now many parts of the country are on fire, looters, vandalism, marches, protests, and all the rest in between. Lots of talk about racism, lots of talks about rioting, and how to change things in our world. Now, we're going to be talking about why Christians should become teachers. And because part of the problem is that without properly understanding the roots to the problem, you can't actually come to the proper solution. And so that's what we're going to be discussing on this first section here of this episode, the root and solution to racism and hatred. Now, we're going to be discussing this from a biblical perspective, of course. I want to jump right into some of the things we need to know about ourselves, about children, about the people in the community and the entire nation and the people in the world. When we go to Scripture, we start with this in Genesis 1:27, quote, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." Now, this first passage right here starts with a simple concept that all mankind is created equally in the image of God. Now, there might be some variations in mankind, of course, visual variations, variations of the physical types, what we look like, where we live at, different things like that. But one main basis that's taught by Scripture is that mankind was, number one, created by God, and all of mankind was created in his image, male and female. This is the Christian basis for bringing people together and what it means actually to be human, to be a person. You have to start with that, because if you're going to talk to other people, you have to have a common ground. I think that's the right word for it, common ground. And the common ground for all of mankind is that we were all created equally important and in the image of God. Now, the next part I want to go ahead and discuss, we're going to be going through quite a few Bible verses because people like to throw their opinions out on this subject. But I would prefer not to be on opinion and more on facts of scriptural basis. Christian education, talking about teachers, what they're going to be teaching. Because when we're discussing this subject, you're going to be taking this into a classroom. It affects how you teach, especially in young children. People often say the quote and the terminology, racism or hatred is something you have to teach. It's learned behavior. And there's some truth to that, and there's some truth not to that. And so you can't properly understand this situation. You can't properly teach this concept or avoid the concept or how to heal the concept or get rid of the problem without properly understanding the basis for it. So let's continue here. Beyond the concept that we are all equally created in the image of God, which the public school and humanism does not teach. Humanism teaches quite the opposite. It teaches an evolutionary standpoint, a colossal accident. That means people have gone into eugenics. If you're not familiar with eugenics, you can look that up. Eugenics basically is the idea that people wanted to weed out what they considered to be inferior characteristics and traits in people. Kind of like if you wanted a purebred dog. You wouldn't want what they call, at least in the dog breeds, you wouldn't want the mutts. These are the ones where have mixed breeds together. And so eugenics is kind of the idea where in mankind we're going to try to eliminate these types of things. In fact, that's where abortion, a lot of the people, the vast majority of them were involved in eugenics and started abortion, and many of them had very, very specific ideas about the usage of abortion to weed out what they considered to be inferior characteristics of mankind. Now, we won't get too much into that, but the basis that our current educational system falls into is that some variations, as we want to call them, of mankind, some people call them ethnicities, some people call them the races, whatever you want to call them. I like to use the term variations, but whatever. The variations, according to these people, are just splinters of accidental creation, accidental growth, accidental evolution. This means that, yes, from that standpoint, there is no unifying factor. It means that some people can look at humanity and they would not see them equally created in the image of God with variations, but they would see as a accidental evolutionary growth. And they would say, well, some forms of mankind, ethnicities, races, variations, whatever, some are superior to others. And now this is where some people get the idea of superior races or superior ethnicities from this idea. But see, here's the idea, and here's the problem. You can't be upset at people when they do that if you start with the foundation of evolution. The eugenist starts with that idea and says, well, some of these people, some of those people, some of these people, some of those people, they start to evaluate them based on what they think is a better category, benefits, deficits. Instead of seeing people as what they are, they start to apply them based on what they think about is the positives and negatives of people. Now, this is the root of the concept of racism. This is the root of the divide. See, Christians as teachers, we can get underneath that, and we can completely cut out the root of this hatred of mankind. And people call it racism. I just like to prefer to use the word terminology of hatred. Because I don't care why you dislike somebody. I don't care if it's for a specific reason or not. But according to Scripture, according to the Bible, we're not allowed to do that. It doesn't matter who they are, where they come from, what they're supposed to do. That's not what we do. But Christians have this foundation. People that are in the current educational field do not. So what you would say is this, and this is very important, is that the modern educational system breeds racism. It breeds divisions. It breeds divides. It absolutely, from the foundation of its entire thesis, its entire theory, its entire idea, breeds the concept that some are better than others. It breeds the entire idea that some things will evolve with negative characteristics and aspects, and some will evolve with better ones. So the eugenist has it right, if you're coming from a humanistic standpoint, that if we can guide humanity, we can weed out the negative aspects of humanity, the negative variations, the negative whatever characteristics, and we can try to cultivate the ones we want to propagate. Then we can have or guide mankind's evolutionary stage, its next step into the future. And so what people don't understand is that racism just isn't about people disliking other people. It's really founded on the whole idea that there is no such thing as equality of mankind. From every educational standpoint, from the very foundation in America, right now, today, every public school in America teaches the concept of evolution. And that means, at its very root, it is clearly teaching that some people are inherently better than others. It can't help it. That's exactly what it does. Christianity, on the other hand, does not. It is the only foundation where all of mankind is created equally in the image of God, equally with respect, with variations, of course, but equally in the image of God and equally respectable. Now, I want to go ahead and move on to some more verses, and we kind of pointed that fact out there. That Christians are the only ones who can actually get to the root of mankind hating mankind. But I'd like to jump into the next part of this, about all of mankind is on the same level and is equally protected. Because the very next part here in Genesis 9:6 says this, quote, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man." Unquote. Now this is very important. He's going over the concept. Noah's come off the boat with the animals, and God's telling the people what they can eat, the other animals, and use them for food. But mankind is not allowed to be killed by other mankind. He is a protected special creation in all of his variations. This means we are not allowed to harm and hurt other people for any reason. It doesn't matter. You're not allowed to attack or harm other people for any reason, specifically killing them. So we have this as Christians, Christian teachers. We have this basis here of telling people about how important we are in all of our variations. But on the humanist side of things, they don't have that. Because after all, if things are just a complete cosmic accident, this idea of importance of mankind is really no different than the spider. He's no different than a kumquat. He's no different than a dog. He's no different than a chicken. And so some people kind of laugh at the idea when they find out that there's people out there that are vegan who get upset at the idea of killing animals and eating them. But why would you think that's silly? It's actually very logical and very reasonable if you are a consistent evolutionist. Why? Because if you're consistent in this idea, and if you think that killing people is wrong, but you don't have the basis for why it's wrong because you give up the God of creation and therefore the importance of man, all you can do then is say, well, then all killing is wrong. And since we are all just evolutionary accidents and mankind really is only mankind by a cosmic accident, by a variation that went to a different direction, some of mankind way back in reality used to be chickens, didn't used to be chickens, but they went down the road, the evolutionary road, to become chickens. And mankind took a different turn, and he ended up being mankind. But we're really all the same. We're just all from the same accidental cosmic source. But mankind is not the same as the chickens. He was created a special creation. Now, see, whenever you get rid of this, whenever you don't hold the biblical Christian viewpoint on the subject, then you get rid of mankind's inherent importance, his inherent differentiation between them and the other creatures. You get this idea that somehow the little squirrels running around in the trees are the same as mankind or the same of importance. In fact, right now, in America today, sea turtle babies are more protected than human babies. It's really a sad state of affairs. But it's actually quite common for people. If there's more people than there are sea turtles, then sea turtles are more important from an evolutionary standpoint. But from a biblical standpoint, they're not. Because mankind is special. Mankind is the only creature on planet Earth that was created in the image of God and is special, and has special protections as well. Now, let's go into another part here that talks about the root that we're talking about here. Also in Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, quote, "And the Lord smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything that liveth, as I have done." Unquote. Now this gets into the root problem about hatred and racism in general, where it comes from. Now, people like to say that hatred of other people has to be learned. Well, God says quite differently. It's tied up in the heart of mankind. We call that the sin nature. See, without a biblical background, you have to kind of create a reason for this. People that look at racism or hatred of other peoples, they will look at from a humanistic standpoint, evolutionary standpoint, a biological standpoint, a psychological standpoint, maybe electrical standpoint, chemical standpoint, but not from a spiritual one. See, as people who are Christians who are going to be teaching children, we don't teach that man is just a physical being, but we teach that man is a physical being that is a spirit. He has a body. He has a mind. On the evolutionary side of things, however, he's just a byproduct of accidents. And so people have different ideas about them, but the idea that man is a living soul doesn't even remotely register. So if there's hatred, it must be learned hatred. Therefore, we just have to remove them from their parents. We have to put them in the proper educational surroundings, and then we can get rid of this idea. Now, of course, that doesn't work. Obviously, the public schools are a testament that does not work whatsoever. Even if you do remove people from their families, which of course is a horrible idea to begin with, but that doesn't solve the problem. hatred is still there. Mankind is still going to hate each other because it is tied up in our hearts, because we want to hate other people. See, the idea is that somehow people get the idea that mankind really has got a good heart about him. And there's got to be something out there. It's got to be his being taught. It's got to be his upbringing. It's got to be his experiences. Somebody who's mean to him. Somebody taught him how to be mean. He's got some kind of a chemical imbalance. He's got some kind of a mental imbalance. If we can just talk to him enough, we can just get him on some drugs, we can fix the problem. Well, they can't get to the root because they don't understand what they're dealing with. You're not dealing with a byproduct of accidental creation, we call evolution. You're dealing with a creature who was created in the image of God, who is fallen, and, as the Bible says here, from his youth. Man's heart is evil from his youth. The evil comes from without, and not from the outside into us, but it's from the inside and goes out. And so if you want to get to the root and understand the solution for why people hate, why people harm other people, steal, lie, kill, it's because of this right here. The heart of man, the Bible says, is desperately wicked, and who can know it? Now, the next part I want to go into is another verse, Proverbs 4:14 through 17. Enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not into the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass not by it, and turn from it, and pass away. For they sleep not, except they have done mischief, and their sleep is taken away unless they cause some to fall. For they eat the bread of wickedness, and drink the wine of violence. Now this is another description here of what the wicked man does. The wicked man is the one that is without God. The one that has rejected God. He is, you could say, the common man. The one that has been raised to just want to be himself. These people love to do mischief. I'm not sure if you've seen children before. And we're going to get into some riotous behavior in our next section here. But riotous behavior is the concept of mischief. It wants to do something. It wants to have a problem. It wants to do harm. And it gets a thrill out of it. It enjoys it. Now, if I'm talking to any teachers here and you're listening to this, you should understand this. If you're a parent and you have children, then you should understand this as well. One thing you'll notice about children is what they like to do is they like to be mischievous. We call it mischievous. Sometimes it's kind of a good term. It's an endearing term. Sometimes when you talk about little children, oh, they're just so little mischievous. But it's really not. Being mischievous means that you enjoy to do things that is wrong. And it can be cute when they're little. But when they get older, it's no longer cute. That's when they're burning down cities and flipping cop cars and killing people. Because here in the scripture in Proverbs 4, it talks about they can't even sleep properly unless they fulfilled this desire to be mischievous and to do something, to harm something, to cause somebody to fall, as the Bible says here. They just eat the bread of wickedness. They hunger for it. They drink the wine of violence. They absolutely want to be violent. They absolutely want to do wickedness. They absolutely want to do these things. Now, this is where the root comes in. Hatred of other people comes down to this. Some people just don't wake up in the morning unless they've done something, been able to insult somebody, harm somebody. This doesn't mean racial slurs and things like that, but any possible way you can hurt somebody, cause that person to fall. You can do something terrible to them, something hurtful to them, something harmful to them. This is what mankind wants to do. This is the root that humanism misses. This is the root that no political ideology, no laws can ever correct. Because laws cannot correct the inside of man. And if you want to correct the outside, you want to correct what happens in the real world, then you have to be able to look inside and be able to find out what the problem is. And the problem, once again, God puts his finger on it, is that the heart of man is wicked from his youth. He does not go to sleep unless he's actually done something mischievous, something he shouldn't do. He cannot sleep unless he's actually harmed somebody and caused them to fall. He loves to eat wickedness and drink violence. This is perfect description of if you want to call somebody a hardcore racist, somebody who really just hates somebody else, and it doesn't just be because of their variation, their ethnicity, their skin color, whatever. But any type of hatred that one person has for another, specifically, it can be of hatred of the rich by those people who do not have as much money as them. Just look at the concept of socialism in our world today. Now, this goes right along with this idea of hatred of somebody because they have more. There are people who hate people who are poor. There are people who hate people who live in different countries for no other reason than they live in a different country. Or there's people who absolutely despise other people who speak a different language. I've run into it. And if you are in the educational field, and for any length of time, I know you've run into it as well. There's no reason for this type of hatred for other people. There's no reason to dislike other people. But if we understand the root cause, as we're discussing here, then we understand why people do these things, because they love to do it. Now, Christians, this is why we should become teachers. We have the solution. And there's a couple different questions about this idea of racism and solutions. Now, number one, we do have to understand the root problem, and we can get to that, fixing the root problem. But let's say that you're not the person that has the problem. Maybe you are what people will call the victim, or you're the recipient of hatred. You're the recipient of actual racism, where somebody hates you just based on what you look like. And that obviously takes place in the real world. But let's say you are. How are you going to fix that problem? Is it going to fix the problem by making signs and holding them up? Is that going to change the world? Are you going to change the world by burning stuff down? Picketing? Standing in front of cops and shouting at them, screaming at them? Is that going to fix anything? See, first of all, we don't understand the root problem of hatred, which we've been going over, because humanism cannot put its finger on racism or hatred. It can't put its finger on why people like to cause violence and riotous behavior, but Christians can. And then not only can it not define it or understand where it comes from, it doesn't have a solution for it. It just doesn't have one. Now, there's a couple things here that I would like to point out, and we're going to wrap up this first section here as we're talking about this concept. But the solution to racism, the solution to hatred. Let's start with this, Matthew 19:16 through 19. As I said, I have a lot of Bible verses here. I'm giving you more scripture than I am my own personal opinion. Quote, "And behold, one came and said to him, Good master, what good thing shall I do that I may inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. He saith unto him, Which? And Jesus said, Thou shalt do no murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Now, here's a good place to start for the solution to hatred of other mankind. If you are going to properly understand what it means to be fair, to have equality, justice, then you are going to have to understand this concept here, loving your neighbor as yourself. If you want to say, well, I'm not one of those people. I don't have hatred in my heart towards other people. I don't treat other people unfairly. Well, how do you know you don't? This is what the Christian's answer is. This is how you can look at yourself. Personal evaluation. See, everybody likes to evaluate other people to see if they have hatred in their hearts. But as teachers, as Christians, as parents, we shouldn't be telling other people to find other people that are guilty of this sin, this hatred of other mankind, treating them unfairly, hurting them for no reason. We should be looking at ourselves. Are you guilty of this problem? Don't let somebody else tell you that you're guilty. You're not guilty by association. You're not guilty because somebody else did something. The question is, have you done it? And you can't just have somebody say, well, you are guilty of this. Well, if you haven't done it, you're not guilty of it. But you should ask yourself the question, am I guilty of it? And if you are, then you have to fix the problem. See, the world is always so focused on trying to point their fingers at other people to say, you're guilty of this, and you're guilty of that, and you're guilty of this, and you're guilty of that. But it seems that they only want to point fingers. They only want to demonize. They don't actually have reconciliation involved. They want to perpetually blame somebody else. Even if a person is not guilty, they want to blame them. And if the person is guilty, then there is no forgiveness to be found in humanism. But there is in Christianity. And you evaluate yourself based on this concept. Do you love your neighbor as yourself? Now that's a good question, because what exactly does it mean to be a neighbor? And I won't go through this part of it because it's kind of long. But we've heard the concept of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan can be found in Luke 10:25 through 27. And here, somebody asked this question and said, well, who is my neighbor? He was trying to justify himself, one of these guys. And Jesus went through the story about two men who saw an injured man walk by and refused to help him. And then another man, a Samaritan, somebody who would be natural enemies for the most part to one of the Jewish people. The two did not have anything to do with each other. You could say bad blood between them. But whenever the Samaritan man saw the Jew beaten up, robbed, harmed, in need of help, he walked over and helped. He put him on his own horse. He took him to an inn. He paid with his own money. He bandaged his wounds. He paid the innkeeper so that way he'd be fully taken care of, and when he returned, he'd pay more if he needed to take care of the man. This is what Jesus says is our response to how we're supposed to treat other people. It doesn't matter that we are not the same. It doesn't matter if somebody likes you or they don't like you. See, beyond your own personal reflection to see if you are treating somebody as you would have them treat you, if you're keeping the commandments towards that person, the next question is what do you do towards somebody who may even dislike you? The solution to it. What is the solution to people who hate you? Well, partly here is keeping the commandments towards those people. That's a good place to start. Instead of going out and screaming in people's faces, instead of yelling and being upset, definitely flipping cars and burning stuff, yelling at police officers, instead, this should be it. Doing good to those people that you have divisions with. If they need help, you're there to help them. It doesn't matter if this person likes you or doesn't like you. Now, we're talking about a person who is possibly on the reciprocation side, a person who doesn't like them. How do you overcome that? How do you move on? How do you not see yourself as some form of a victim because you can't change the other person? Well, we're getting to that a little more. Matthew 5:43 through 48. Quote, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love them which love you, what reward have you? Do not even the publicans the same? And if you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." Unquote. That's Matthew 5:43 through 48. That here is not only the root, but the solution. The solution is you can't change other people. Now you can look into your own heart to see if you are keeping the commandments towards other people, which is the definition of love, to see if you're treating your neighbor as yourself. And the neighbor, of course, is all those around you. It's not just your friends, but even people who don't necessarily like you, or maybe you have opposition to, or maybe you're different than. But these are people that you will go out of your way to help, despite who they are. Then here it says, well, what are you supposed to do to somebody who dislikes you? How do you fix that problem? And Jesus' answer is simple. To love those that even hate you. And love, we just defined it in the passage previous, which is the keeping of the commandments. It doesn't mean that you like the fact that somebody doesn't like you. It doesn't mean that you like the fact that somebody says something against you or really does actually hate you. But it's not about them, because you can't fix them. The question is what about you? You're not a victim. They can't control you. So a person hates you. So a person says some things that are very terrible. You can't control that person. You can control your actions, though. You can control how that affects you. You can control what you do in reciprocation to that. You don't have to be some kind of a perpetual victim to such things. It doesn't matter what the reason is or why somebody dislikes you. It doesn't matter what kind of person or how they've hurt you or why they've hurt you. Here, God gives us the solution. Christians have an answer to what we should be doing to people who have hatred towards us. And the answer is that it does not change us. Somebody does something terrible. Does that mean you get to go do things terrible in return? Now here, we're now in June 2020, and people all throughout America are upset because people are upset over police officers and things that were done wrong with various other peoples. And they've taken to the streets. And they thought that because they have a legitimate outrage, a real atrocity was committed, a real injustice, because there has been an injustice in America, we get to do whatever we want. We get to burn down shops, break windows, flip cars, loot and riot all over the place. Right now, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they've taken over, I believe it is 6 blocks. 6 blocks. They've taken over, so all the businesses there and people can't even go and do their normal jobs. This was their reaction to supposed outrage or legitimate outrages. And this isn't just one circumstance. It's every circumstance in our lives or the children that we teach. What are we supposed to do when you're in the classroom and somebody does something wrong to you? Does that mean you get to slap them upside the face because now they did something first, so I get to do it back? Is that what we're teaching our children? Well, it is what we're actually saying out loud. See, without Christianity, you have a complete cycle of sin and evil. A sick cycle that people cannot get away from. They can't be released from it. There is no forgiveness in this cycle. You did this, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to get you back, so you did this, and I'm going to do it back to you. See, Christianity says we break the cycle of sin. We break the cycle of violence and hatred by doing good. This is how the cycle is broken. You cannot change other people, but you can, with God's help, change how you react to it. And that's what our children need to learn. They're not going to be able to control the world. They can't change the world overnight. They can't even change what somebody else does. But they can change how it affects them. They do control what they do in return. And this is what God says. Do not return hatred for hatred. Here, do good to those people. Keep the commandments towards them. Don't return hatred for hatred. And one more Bible verse here, and then we're going to leave this for now, discussing the root and the solution. And the solution, of course, as I said, is education. Teaching what each of us needs to look in our hearts. We need to go to God, asking for forgiveness, and hoping that God will help us to keep the commandments instead of break them towards our fellow man. And for those people who don't care about God's commandments and don't care about breaking them, as we've said here before, they just love violence. They can't sleep unless they've done something terrible. Well, the way to react towards those people is to keep the commandments towards them. Even if they hate you and they despitefully use you, you keep doing good to them. See, God's going to take care of it. And that's another thing that humanism doesn't have and our educational system doesn't have. If they don't fix the problem right now, it won't get fixed. We have to be the ones to do it. But Christians don't say that. There is a God in heaven who is watching. He's watching what other people do to us, and he's watching what we do to them. And it doesn't matter what happens to those people. You can't control that. That's between them and God. But you can control what you do. You can control if you allow things to affect you. And you can rise above such things with God's help. See, in humanism, you have perpetual victims. People who are always perpetually the victim of someone else. And they have to right the wrongs themselves or they'll never be corrected. There's just no peace there. No peace at all. Teaching your children, there's also no peace. The schools, by their very basis, are laying the foundation for racism and hatred based on their evolutionary standpoint, which separates mankind from the very beginning. Then after that, there is no God, there's no judgment, there's nobody watching. If we don't fix it now, nobody's going to fix it. And so they can't help but turn hatred into hatred and perpetuate the cycle again and again and again and again, and can never get outside of it. But Christians, we can do better. We can teach better. We can help our students rise above such things. Could you imagine if somebody went on the nightly news and this is the message they were given instead? Rise above it. Instead of burning stuff down, if there was a legitimate issue, they were trying to keep the commandments. Now, this does not mean that justice is not sought for real injustices. If there is a police officer who kills somebody accidentally or on purpose, they should stand trial. Justice should be had for that person. But if you perceive a problem, it does not give you the right to act however you want. And I'll end with this first section here with Romans 12:14 through 21. Quote, "Bless them which persecute you. Bless and curse not. Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. Be of the same mind one towards another. Mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Because be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." And that is the kicker. That is the solution to racism and to hatred. Leave the petty, pathetic, worthless, vengeful, mischievous people to themselves. Overcome them. Don't let them victimize you. Don't let the person, for any reason, who's bothering you, picking on you for any reason, don't allow that to affect you. God's got it under control. As it says here, leave room for God. You have to understand, what we're dealing with here is God, who is kinder than we are, but is also harsher than we are. When we leave place for God, when we teach our children this kind of concept here, you recompense no man evil for evil. You don't have to go after somebody because they did something terrible to you. You don't have to curse somebody because they're cursing you. You can bless them instead. Now, that doesn't mean blessing what they've done. It doesn't mean agreeing that what they're doing is okay. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is you and what your actions are towards someone else. As I said before, what they do is between them and God, and that's what this is talking about here. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. Let God take care of your problems. Christians can say that. The humanistic educational system of our world cannot say that. If it is not resolved here and now, it will never be resolved. If you don't get them right now, no one will get them. If you don't correct the problem now, no one will correct it. That leads to a horrible, terrible life. A sick cycle of vengeance, personal vengeance, where if you don't get even, they get away with it. Christians are, on the other hand, telling our children as they grow up, and they're going to go into a world full of hatred, because as we said here, the heart of man is desperately wicked, and who can know it? They're never going to get out of a world where people don't hate other people, but they don't have to participate. They don't have to add their own sins into it. They can leave it up to God. Allow God to deal with it. And they can be rewarded for their behavior. So when the people who hate you are hungry, you feed them. When they are thirsty, you give them drink. And the kicker is this. You want to get back at somebody who hates you. You really want to get back at them. What's the worst thing you could ever do, according to God? Be nice to them. God says here, when you don't reciprocate, when you're kind, when you obey the commandments towards those people, specifically those that hate you, you're heaping coals of fire on their head. You're giving them no justification for their hatred. They're having to hate you, and you're revealing to them that their hatred, their problem is not you. Their problem is their own hearts. And if they don't repent of what they're doing, God's going to take care of it. God's keeping score. He knows what's going on. And you need to know that, and you need to teach that to your children at home, if you're a parent. If you're in the classroom, this is what your children need to learn. We can overcome the world through such things. But when we ripped out Christianity from our homes and from our schools, even our churches, we lost this idea. We don't know the problem. We don't know how to fix it. We don't know how to act. We don't have any guidance to give to anybody. But the true Christian does. We can overcome evil with good. So we're going to go ahead and move on here to our next sections. I want to point out a few things. Rest Union Radio. Check that out, restunionieradio.org. And also, of course, if you are wanting to find out more podcasts, we have on cr101radio.com more podcasts besides this one to check out as well. So there's plenty of things on there to look at if you have time. But our next section we're going to deal with, and be somewhat brief, is how to deal with racism and riotous behavior actually at a school. What we're talking about in Section 1 is mostly about theoretical stuff. It's about the stuff of understanding the root, guidance for it. But now let me give you some tips on actually how to deal with racism, real racism, and riotous behavior in the school and in the classroom. Let's go ahead and start with what you should do as a kind of a school standard. I guess that's a good word for it. Number one, a Christian school, should allow any family to enroll their children in their school. Now, this means any form of variation, ethnicity, race, whatever you want to call it, should be welcome in your school. I mean, that is number one. This is how you overcome this concept. You are not biased. Christians are not biased. That is number one. Number two, the educational standard. A Christian school should be educating all children on the same level. And since you're already, of course, bringing in all families from any walk of life that there is, you're also giving them the same level of education. Complete equality as far as education is concerned, and they can move to the level at which they can. And all children are different. It doesn't matter who they are, where they come from. But educationally speaking, they all have different abilities. Some are faster, some need more help. Perfectly okay. But all children will receive the same level of education in a Christian school. Now, all throughout history, especially from an evolutionary standpoint in particular, and whenever Christianity is not present, this is not the case. Boys and girls, men and women, are not seen to be of equal standing. Been many times throughout history that women were never taught to read or many other things in education whatsoever. And, of course, many times throughout all of history, we're talking about mankind in general, not just America, but this has been a constant problem where they didn't view each other as equals as far as education is concerned. But in a Christian school, you should. The next concept would be a classroom standard, about holding all children accountable to the same level of behavior standards. Now, you'll see in America today, they do want different standards for people. And on one hand, they would say they want equality. On the other hand, they want different standards for different people based on where they come from, their level of, if they have a certain level of income, if they have a certain ethnicity. They don't actually want people to be equally treated based on behavior standards. The evolutionary standpoint does not want that. But Christians do. We want everybody to be on the same standard. The standard is God's law and the commandments, treating each other equally according to the law, as we were discussing earlier. So, everyone should be on the same footing. We have an employment standard as well, where you hire people who are qualified to work in your school. That should also be something that Christians do as well. You see people, if they're qualified, they're all equal as far as that is concerned. And it's a very simple concept. But once again, all throughout the world, that has not been the case. And the further businesses and countries and nations go away from Christianity, the more bias is involved in these kinds of concepts. There's an economic standard, of course, as well, where you hold all parents the same standard from their contracts as well. In other words, whatever your rate is for a 4-year-old, that's the same rate for everybody. And anything like that, all parents, all customers are going to be treated the same. There is, of course, also the religious standard. To teach all children they are made in the image of God and equally responsible to Him. This also includes parents as well. How you interact with people becomes very quick and apparent if you do or don't have respect for people. Now, the Christian, it should come across very quickly to the student, the customer, to the staff, that as a Christian, you hold the standard that every single person is made in the image of God, equally worthy of respect. Not a single person is different in that aspect. Now, of course, how they act, as we went back to the behavior standards, that's different. Now, to give us some anecdotes about how these things play out, the world is full of people who have differing views. There are a lot of them. But once again, their views, you can't allow them to change or influence you, nor should you back down or be scared and other things. You will, in a country like America, run into people who want to be treated differently or accuse you of treating them differently when you're not. The concept of equality, especially in the educational realm and other places, is not known. Even in colleges and things like that, they have very specific grants and things like that, scholarships, for people of certain ethnicities. I mean, in the educational field itself, we have very specific ideas about this concept, who deserves more help and all the rest in between. We really don't, in our educational fields, believe in what we call equality. But some ideas of what we should do, I've run into myself, is this. You'll have some people asking about enrollment. Oh, do you have children here? I've had one person come in and say, how many white people do you have? How many Hispanics do you have? How many blacks do you have? How many whatevers do you have? And I've actually had people ask me that question, and they come in as a visitor, and because they're concerned, they don't want their child to be in a school that's all comprised of one variation of mankind, one ethnicity. But when they come into one of my schools that I've been in charge of or supervise, they're always pleasantly surprised because we have a diverse school. We've had state officials come into our facilities, our Christian schools, and they were actually shocked. They said, your schools are some of the most diverse schools I've ever seen. Now, what that means, without actually saying it, is that in general, the government schools, preschools in general, are not very diverse. They're not very diverse because they don't have Christian values. As I said, the less Christian influence anything has, an institution, a business, an educational area, the less equality you will have. Equality of who we are, our respectability, our image of God, respectability. And yes, most preschools are not very diverse. Christian ones, however, they are, because they do not discriminate based on that concept, where most people do. Education of children is an important one as well, because we believe all children as Christians should be taught. And so we're going to be teaching those kids just as enthusiastically as we would anybody else. It doesn't matter who they are, which families they come from, rich and poor, and all the rest in between. And we've run into that kind of concept too. People are shocked and surprised that a Christian school would be able to educate as well as we do. But in my school, the education that all the children receive is the same level. And so you're trying to bring up all peoples from no matter which walk of life they come from. They all deserve that level of respect and that level of education. Now, I have had people run into the idea of the behavioral concept. And I've had people try to insinuate that their children are being picked on based on their ethnicity. Now, people do this because they don't want their child to get into trouble, or they don't want to have to go to a different child care facility or whatever. And I had to deal with that one time. A person was accusing me of picking on their child because I just didn't like their their family background or their ethnicity. Well, the way to look at that and the way to deal with it is very simple. You just talk to the person and say, well, here's what we're dealing with here. And in this case, the child had violent behavior where they were hurting and harming other people by punching them in the face. And I remember talking to the father who was the one making the accusation. And I said, is it okay for your child to strike other people in the face? He said, well, no, it's not. I said, and it's obvious we have tried to deal with the child's behavior and we've tried to enlist your help. Is that correct? And of course, he had to agree that it was exactly as I said it was. And then, of course, I said, then that has nothing whatsoever to do with your family, where you come from, or your ethnicity. We're strictly dealing with your child's behavior. Now, I then kind of gave a warning and a reprove to the gentleman and said, if I say something that is inappropriate along the lines of sidelining your ethnicity or your family or your background, I'd be glad for you to point that out to me. I'd be glad for you to hold me accountable for that. But if I don't, I find it insulting and do not appreciate the accusations. And there's no need for it. If we're here to help your child, that kind of stuff just gets in the way. That kind of stuff diverts the attention away from helping the actual child and dealing with the actual behavior. But you're going to run into people like that. They've been taught that, some people have, from the time that they were young. That if you want to get your way, you just claim that somebody hates you because of your ethnicity. Call them racist. And then all of a sudden, people get scared, people back down. You can intimidate people, and people will try to intimidate you. But you can't let it. As I mentioned earlier before, if you know that you're not doing something wrong, there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. And I find it absolutely one of those things you should hold people accountable who try to falsely accuse you of things. It's inappropriate. And this is what we're talking about holding everybody to the same standard. Because all children should be held to the same standard because they're all equally responsible to obey God's commandments. And, of course, the same level of respect is due from parents. They have to respect you. You have to respect them as well. And this also can be a staff thing as well. Staff will also try to get somebody not to come down on them for doing their job. Comments of racism or accusations of racism or partiality are very, very common. And the way to withstand such things is very simple. To know what you have done. To lay a clear track record out. And if somebody actually does say that, they could actually feel that way. So you shouldn't just jump down their throat and assume that they're just making some wild accusation. Ask them, well, what makes you think that? And see what they have to say. Now, if they have no reasons for their commentaries and things like that, then you might want to take them to task, purposely falsely accusing you to manipulate. But otherwise, there could be some legitimate questions there that there's some misunderstandings. And so if you're doing your job, it should not bother you to have a good conversation with a staff member, with a parent, or any other thing that goes on in between. Now, we've also run into it where we have run into children who were doing things as well. And children who had actually said things to other people that were inappropriate based on racial or ethnic lines. And you deal with it like you would anything else. Now, some people would want to deal with this in a more harsh way. But as I said from the beginning, the concept of racism or partiality goes along the lines of hatred. It doesn't matter if you like somebody because they're tall or they're short, make somebody because of their skinny or because they're fat. It does not matter why a person is either doing something or causing somebody harm. They're doing so inappropriately. And so you can deal with it the same as you would anything else. And I remember I've dealt with that many times like that. And so you deal with the child, you talk to them about not allowing them to do such things, say such things, whatever it might be. And then, of course, dealing with and talking with the parents as well. Because once again, if you had a person who's just calling somebody fat to purposely harm them or to make them feel bad, this is absolutely inappropriate. And any behavior that has deliberately intention to harm somebody else is something you have to work on. It's something that you're going to have to fix and take care of and repair the relationship. Because when children come to your school, they need to feel that level of respect. And you are going to hold people accountable if they attempt not to give them the level of respect. As we said here, their God-given image of God respect that they deserve. So hopefully that'll help you out with how to deal with some of these things. But as I said before, if you've kind of grasped the concept I've dealt with earlier in our first section, it pours over into this section. about how to teach your students, primarily, especially with young children, getting in there young. You're able to teach them the importance of treating each other as an image bearer of God, and how they're supposed to treat each other. And, of course, the proper way in order to deal with people who are trying to be partial or harmful to you. And there are certain ways to do that. And it does not mean you have to get yourself in trouble or do something yourself to harm somebody because somebody is doing something inappropriate to you. So I want to remind you that we do book giveaways on our website at cr101radio.com. We also have a mailing list you can apply for as well. We give out emails there to keep you updated on what we do. You can check those out on our website at cr101radio.com. And our last section here, I just want to deal with a few things, but it won't be very long. I have had some people talk to me about how to start a Christian school. And once again, education is where it's at. If you want to deal with society's ills, if you want to try to help become a solution to the problem, not just talk about it, then education is where it's at. And Christians do need to become teachers because we have the solutions. We know what the problem is. We know how to fix it. And we can make a difference. But you do have to get there early, especially with most people in particular. The first formidable years are when they're young. And so if you wanted to start a school, it's actually more complicated than most people think. Now, we do have what's called our preschool in a box on our website at gcsapprenticeship.com, so you can check that out. And it has everything that you would need as far as materials to start a preschool. There's lots of other considerations, of course, as well, because you have to think of it more like a business than you would anything else. But, of course, Christians, if they do their job properly, can make a major impact. But to start a school and to run a school properly, it does take commitment, much more than most people are willing to do or even understand. But you can check out our information on our website at gcsapprenticeship.com for more information on that. And as I said before, it's something that I think you should check out too. I think that Christians should become teachers. If you can't become one, maybe you know somebody who wants to be one, and we can help them out. So, I want to thank everybody for joining us, of course. You can remember to follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and all the major podcast platforms have our podcasts on there now. And, of course, a plug for our apprenticeship, our sponsors, gcsapprenticeship.com. You want to become a Christian teacher or start your own school, of course, well, we can help. And, of course, I was just talking about that a second ago as well. So the solution to riotous behavior, the solution to hatred of mankind, is that they need a Christian education. They need to be taught the commandments of God to see where they're deficient. They need to be taught Jesus Christ so they can go and have a way to be forgiven of those sins, real forgiveness. And then, of course, they know how to treat others and what to do for their families and for other people in society. So I do want to thank everybody again for joining us today. My name is Jeremy Walker. I wanted to promote you to get out there and get involved with your families and, of course, to start a school if you can. So thank you very much, and God bless.